Welcome to Cultimatum, the culture of cults, a podcast dedicated to supporting survivors of cults and human trafficking. This show is hosted by myself, Anonymous Andrew.
And my name is Melody. I'm going to be Andrew's co-host. I'm also a cult survivor myself from a cult called the House of Yahweh. I am a cult advocate and creator and administrator of a cult support group on Facebook called Cult Escape and Recovery. For guests on our show, we do want them to understand that we respect privacy concerns. You can always remain anonymous or use a fake name.
And Melody, this is a safe haven for those who have been in a cult, survived, and escaped, and are now on a journey of recovery, trying to put their life back together. So join us as we learn together about the culture of cults.
And Andrew, we also want to add a trigger warning that some episodes may contain explicit subjects including sex abuse, rape, human trafficking, suicide, and other potentially disturbing topics.
Welcome to Cultimatum, the culture of cults. And we have a very interesting episode for you today. First, this is our second episode. So if you heard the pilot, this is episode number 2. But interestingly, I am about to interview my co-host. And well, so welcome, Melody. Hi.
Hi. How are you doing today, Andrew?
One day at a time, getting through. The audience may or may not know I'm having hip surgery, so it's just each day is literally trying to get through the day. Thank you, countdown. But so Melody, before Melody and I formally teamed up and made a podcast, the Cultimatum podcast, as you are listening to it now, we did do an interview, and she was my first interview in the second pod series under the Anonymous Andrew podcast. And when Melanie and I were discussing the order of what episode we should put up next, we listened to the other episode and we thought that we could do a better job. And I thought that we could, Melanie and I, now that she's my co-host, it would be a more comfortable interview. So
that's true.
We're re-recording the interview. So
there we go. So
all right.
I'm
okay. So
telling my story.
But I am going to treat you like a guest a little bit because you are a guest, and as far as a cult survivor, but you're my co-host as well. So you're wearing 2 hats tonight. All right.
Yes.
So I am going to shut up and let you tell your story.
Okay. I joined a cult called the House of Yahweh when I was a teenager with my mom, my dad, and my sister. We joined in 1989 when I was 15 years old. I was engaged by the time I was 16 to the leader's son. I was married by the time that I was 18 in 1992. I will say that I'm going to give my dad some credit there. The reason that I waited until 18 and didn't get married at 16 was because my dad was insistent that I got my high school diploma before I got married. And for that, I'm very grateful because there are a lot of people in the House of Yahweh that do not and did not get their high school diplomas because they got married or they just dropped out to do the work of Yahweh, which is basically working for the organization. And so I was lucky to get my diploma. And then I got pregnant shortly after getting married and gave birth to my oldest child in October of 1994. And that was, I never saw any doctors. They didn't believe in doctors. It was all midwives. And it was a pretty dangerous birth. He was 9 pounds, 4 ounces. And I think in a hospital, well, I was 16 days overdue. So first of all, in a hospital, they would not have let me go that far overdue. And second, they probably would have done an ultrasound and saw how big he was and said, she needs a C-section. And I wouldn't have had to go through 48 hours of labor. They would have said, this baby's too big. We're going to take him C-section.
Let's take him out. Right.
Yes, exactly. And during that exact time when I was having my son is when a lot of the teachings of the House of Yahweh started to take a pretty major turn, and they started teaching about multiple marriage. And I'm going to say that the main reason they started teaching, or should I say he, which is the leader, Israel Hawkins, who was my father-in-law, he actually did pass away in 2021 at 87 years old. But he got basically caught cheating with his secretary, and instead of even apologizing to his wife or maybe saying I'm sorry and trying to mend things, he just said, I haven't sinned. I've done nothing wrong. She's just another wife. She's my concubine, and you have to accept this. And of course, my mother-in-law was heartbroken, and I was seeing that going on every day. She was crying because I was working with her in her house at that time, and I was seeing the devastation that she had. And I was going through this phase of back and forth between, okay, this is my religion, so I have to accept this, and I have to believe this, and I have to go along with this, to, oh my gosh, I can't accept this. I don't think I can live like this. I'm too jealous of a person to share my spouse. And so I was going very back and forth with all this, because when they bring new teachings like that, you do feel, and you're taught and almost conditioned to accept any new teachings. And I was not accepting it very well. I was really going back and forth, teetering on what I wanted to do with that. And now I will say, since then, I mean, it's become a lot more extreme, even since I left, because now they have a wall built in the sanctuary separating the men completely from the women. The women are on one side, the men are on the other. They don't even, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but I do believe they don't even hear the same sermons. They get totally different information based on their gender. At least I know it was that way at one time. I'm not sure that it still is, but it used to be. So, and now the women, like, they have to, but when we were there, we had to cover our knees and we couldn't show our arms, but now they can't, they have to wear, like a burqa almost. They're like covered down to their wrists.
Wow.
They have to be covered down to their ankles. They have to wear a face mask to cover up their nose and their mouth. The only thing showing is their eyes, because you also have to wear a headscarf when you're in the actual sanctuary. So, and I know that they started getting more strict on that too, to where it wasn't just in the sanctuary. You had to wear that even outside of the sanctuary, like on the grounds, anywhere or what most people would call a compound, but they had their own name for it. They called it the 44 acres. But basically and it's certainly more of a compound now.
Melody, I find this so fascinating, not in a good way, that the contradictions, or the do as I say, not as I do attitude, where so you have to walk around basically, well, you didn't, but you're saying now they're doing, like walking in burqas, or having to cover, and yet, and I don't remember if you told me this before we recorded, but you said that your father-in-law was having an affair?
Yes, the leader. Yep.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, so the concept of the woman covering herself is so the men aren't tempted. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. Yes.
Okay. But so you have to walk around, or again, not maybe you, because
meaning women in general.
But this leader, this pastor, the whatever, but he can go do the exact opposite of what he's telling you can't do.
Exactly. It's actually his mindset that created his paranoia, that he came up with this. And I think really the main reason that the women now have to dress like this and wear all this stuff and cover themselves up is because now with the multiple marriage thing, all of the women, especially the young, attractive women, are really reserved for the older elders and men. And therefore, they don't
Of
want the
course.
younger men to see these younger, beautiful girls because they don't want the competition. They want these younger, beautiful girls for themselves. And therefore, it actually got, I mean, to the point where a lot of the younger men ended up leaving and being chased off from the organization because they really didn't want them there. The older men didn't want them there. The leaders and the elders wanted them gone because they were competition. So they were kind of chased off. And the sad part is these boys, and because they're young teenage boys, I mean, even the ones in their, late teens, early 20s, were being pushed out and forced out into a world they had no idea how to live in, no idea how to cope. A lot of them ended up kind of banding together and renting a house together and living and muddling through this together because most of them did not have diplomas, did not have skills, and they were now ostracized and they had to figure out how they're going to make it in the world. And so I'm sure, and I've, a lot of them have actually done very well for themselves. Actually, a lot of them did end up going into the military, and I think it's partly because they were so used to being told what to do. That was an environment that they felt very comfortable in. But a lot of them are actually
Sure.
doing very well now, so I'll give them a lot of credit. A lot of those guys are doing really good.
Wait,
But
so the guys that went into the military, is that leaving the cult or that's just
that
they're
was, yes,
still in?
after leaving. After leaving, they ended up
Okay,
being
okay.
drawn into the military, correct? Yes. I think they kind of laughed and then they floundered and didn't know what to do with themselves and figured, well, I think I'm just going to join the military and find some direction. And I think it helped a lot of them.
Okay.
I did end up ultimately leaving in 1994. And that was based on the fact that, you know, myself and my ex and my sister-in-law and brother-in-law and my mother-in-law were not complying with this new teaching the way that the leader wanted us to, who was also my father-in-law. And I think he wanted to make an example of us because we were, members of his more immediate family, and he couldn't get us under control. So it didn't look good for him. We didn't make him
No.
look good. So as
Well,
we were
by the
kind of,
way, he
go
he
ahead.
did a good job. He did a good job of that on his own, not looking good,
Yes,
because
exactly.
it just every cult that we do, every interview we do, it always seems to be the leader, the apostle, the pastor, whoever is a control freak, right?
Yes.
It just seems to come down to that, and this seems to be no different.
Yeah, I
Do
think it
and
takes a
again,
certain
do as
type
I
of
say, don't do as
personality.
I do.
Yeah. And I think certain type of
Yeah.
personality is drawn to that kind of role. And I think they do have a lot of similarities for that reason, because I think you have to be pretty egotistical, first of all. And I think you have to be,
How about
go ahead.
how about narcissist? How about
Yes,
narcissist?
narcissistic, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
I think they're almost all narcissistic for sure. And certainly pathological and diabolical. They just all seem to have a lot of very similar traits, and he was no exception. He did at one
And
point get arrested eventually, but the charges did not stick. But he was arrested for bigamy and child labor laws because he was having young children work in basically by the time in the early 2000s, it got to the point where people weren't supposed to shop outside the organization. They had their own grocery store, that you had to buy your food there, you had to buy your meat there. And so he had young boys working in the butcher shop, butchering animals. He had young girls churning butter and making their own butter and working in the cafeteria. And so it got to the point where people were very isolated because it became more and more of a very cult-like compound where they weren't even supposed to go into the outside world. Of course, it wasn't quite to that level when I was there, but it was starting, it was going in that direction. So, and when I left, so we actually did end up getting excommunicated. All five of us got excommunicated together, but we were getting ready to leave anyway. So I guess he
Let me
decided.
let me ask you let me ask you something about excommunication because
Mhm.
I again listening to other interviews of people
Yep.
we've already recorded, many people who want to get out, quote unquote, escape,
Yes.
or it's hard for them to do that, or they're fearful, or they're anxious about it because they don't know what waits for them on the other side.
Right.
And but in your case, you literally got kicked out. You were just
Right.
like you're out. So is that easier to be excommunicated, even though there may be some shame associated with it?
I think in some ways it can be. I think in some ways, because I can tell you that it actually came with a sense of relief for me because I felt like I didn't choose to leave on my own be, because there was a lot of guilt associated with that because of the brainwashing. You believed, oh gosh, if I leave, I'm leaving the truth, I'm leaving my religion, I'm leaving what I believe, and I'm going to burn in hell. And then I'm like, well, how can God hold me accountable or Yahweh hold me accountable when I was kicked out? So I'm like, I think I'm still going to be
Right.
okay. I think Yahweh will forgive me for this because this isn't my fault. I was kicked out. But the reason they
And
kick you
and
out.
you had your family with you.
Yes, yes, not just my mother-in-law, my husband at the time, and then my brother and sister-in-law, but also my mom and dad and sister left during that same time period too, because they did not agree with the multiple marriage teaching. And actually, there was
Okay.
quite an exodus. There were quite a number of people that left during that time period. I don't know what the exact number is, especially since I left myself. I wasn't completely aware of everyone that left, but I do know a large number of people left during that time. And the unfortunate
Okay.
thing is I think it was really a lot of the good members and best members that had, good intentions. And I think that the way they went actually attracted a lot of, for lack of a better word, a lot of child abusers and stuff started going in there because, if you're a guy who thinks, if you're an older man who is attracted to younger women, what a better place to go than into a cult where they hand them to you on a plate, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
They serve them up.
yeah,
Oh God. Oh.
exactly. So that's the kind of people that end up getting attracted into these cults is because they're like, wow, that's a great place for me to go. They're letting all these old guys marry multiple young girls. So it's, and I will say that, and I don't remember if I'd said this in my other interview or not, but at one point, I think I did, but at one point, one of my friends that had left, I talked to her, and she left about probably 15 years after me. And I talked to her and said, well, I had heard that Israel now has like 30 wives or something. And she kind of laughed. And so I
Oh
thought, well,
God.
that must be an exaggeration, right? I'm thinking when she laughed, this has got to be an exaggeration. And she goes, oh, it's closer to somewhere between 60 and 100, but we don't know the exact number because basically it's kind of kept secret with the only way you kind of know, I guess, who his wives and concubines are based on where they sit in the sanctuary. They have like a more prime front seat up toward the front, and but you don't know where the line exactly is between where, his wives end and other women begin, but who knows?
How many? How many? I don't know what to call them. Congregants, parishioners. How many people were in this cult at the time you were there?
At the time that I was there, they were
Approximately.
claiming about 900. And so, but they were saying there were some small factions, around the world in other countries that couldn't get to the feast because we were expected to show up in person 3 times a year for the Feast of Tabernacles, Passover, and Pentecost. So, but the people who lived in other countries didn't always show up, and they made an exception for those people because they couldn't always get out of their countries to get there. And I know there were a lot of people from like the
Why
Philippines.
pass?
Say that again.
Why Passover? Why Passover?
Because it's in the Bible. There's if you read the Bible, it tells you that the Passover is an 8-day feast, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is associated with Passover.
Okay.
And it's a lot like what the Jewish people do. They celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then also the Jewish people celebrate Tabernacles and Pentecost as well. So it's Jewish
Okay.
feasts that are written in
Just
the
curious.
Bible. So
Yeah. No,
and
I
it was
just
a doomsday cult. I mean, we were preparing for the end of the world. We were storing food. We were keeping very busy and focused, which is another thing that cults like to do. And I guess that really is, they keep you working and busy and focused. So you don't have time to think. You don't have time to analyze what you're doing. You're preparing. You're, earning money to buy food storage and, and pay your tithes
right.
and, doing all this work and trying to recruit new members, helping to print the literature and spread the word and trying to get people to join, because we believed that we were the 144,000 and we were the ones that were going to be saved. And Israel Hawkins was one of the two witnesses, and his brother, who ran another House of Yahweh, actually out of Odessa, Texas, was the other witness, and they were the ones that were going to, preach the word of Yahweh after the 3.5 years of tribulation, and people were going to have to repent. And yeah, it was a whole thing. But because a lot of people ask me too, why did you want to have a baby if you thought the world was ending? And I'm like, well, because I was going to be protected and my baby was going to be protected. I was in the special group, right?
But that's a good question.
Yeah,
Yeah, but that's a good question. I always wondered, these doomsday people, like some of these survivalists who live out in the mountains. I actually know somebody. I'm not going to mention
right,
anything about them, but there is a couple that I know that live off the grid, uh, and they are survivalists, and they're
right.
ready for the doomsday should
Yes.
that come. And
Preppers.
I know them so well that should something like that occur, like whether a nuclear disaster or
Right,
whatever, we'll call it whatever you want, natural disaster, I'm
right.
heading that way because I know them very well, and I know that I'll
And
be.
they'll let you in.
It's just and they'll let me in. It's just a matter of getting there because they're about 10 hours away. But
Yes,
okay,
exactly. And especially,
okay,
talking about
all
leaving
right.
big cities and stuff. And yeah, it would, I don't know. I mean, I've been expecting the world to end since 1989. So whenever anybody predicts, and that's the thing, he would constantly predict the end of the world. And then when it wouldn't come or it didn't happen, he had all these excuses. Well, the
Yeah.
calendar's wrong, and I predicted wrong because the Mayans messed up the calendar, or somebody messed up the calendar somewhere, and so now it's really on this date and it's going to happen at this time. I mean, and I know he did. I think the world was going to end 3 times when I was there during the 5 years, and then I don't know,
Well,
who knows how many times since then.
well, I remember a bad memory, but was it 5, 10 years ago? The Mayans calendar
Yes,
ended, and everybody thought that that was going to be the end of the
yes,
world, and of
everybody
course
was
it
losing
wasn't.
their mind.
So,
Exactly. And Y2K,
yep,
same thing
yep,
happened. Everybody thought, oh,
yep.
yep, it's going to
Oh
be the
my
end.
God, yeah.
So Um, so yes, that was part of the teaching as well, the doomsday stuff, which a lot of cults do that and teach that. And I think that's another thing that people will say is that, well, how could you stay after his prophecies didn't come true? And again, you find
Mm.
ways to justify it. You're like, well, maybe it's an innocent mistake. Maybe he just, this is still the right place, but he just made an honest mistake. And you find ways to justify it, which seems crazy. But when you're in that mindset and you really think you should be there, you should be with these people, and you're in the right place, you find ways to justify the almost unjustifiable. And I felt like even that's what
Melody,
go ahead.
there's there's a word that I use on my other podcasts, and you and I last night when we were creating the pilot. So,
Yes.
just a little bit of insight for the audience. When you put an episode out, you have to put keywords into the episode. So, anybody who's looking for, let's say you're an ex-member of a cult and you're looking for support or you're looking for a podcast,
Right.
you can type in cult survivor, escaping cult, yada yada yada. And Melody, so we had, I don't know, come up with 15 or so keywords, and then Melody threw out the word gaslight or
Yes.
gaslighting.
Yeah.
And that's the term because my whole last relationship was all about gaslighting. And so I'm sorry, what's his name?
Yes.
Israel.
Israel Hawkins. Yep.
Every time he got the doomsday date wrong, he would gaslight you, right?
Exactly.
Because basically
Exactly.
that's what it is. Yeah,
Yes. And then even
it
though
was
there was
all
a part of
gaslighting.
you who thought, a part of your brain that thought, I shouldn't believe what he says anymore because he's obviously lying, then you would find ways to justify the lie. And it's,
And that's what gaslighting is all about. A really good gaslighter
yes,
who knows how to do it well will have you doubting yourself. Like, so if he
absolutely.
predicts this and it doesn't come true and he gives you a gaslighting excuse, you just accept it because
Yes,
otherwise you know,
exactly. No, you find
just
ways to
wanted
justify
to
it
throw that
anyway.
in there.
Yes, no, I appreciate that because it's very true. And the other thing that I we experienced as we were leaving too was there's a lot of as you're trying to leave and get out because even though we were excommunicated, we were still being watched pretty closely. And I think it really is mostly because, in particular, us, because we were part of his immediate family. So, so my mother-in-law was in the process of trying to divorce him, and we were we believed we were being I swear there were microphones in the house. They were listening to our conversations. We had, flashlights were shined in our windows at night. They were watching us. Lots of crazy stuff going on. Lies being told about us. Lies were being spread. Basically, he had to spread lies about us to justify, excommunicating all of us. And one of the lies being told was that we'd stole a bunch of money, which absolutely wasn't true. and because when we actually did finally decide, because eventually I ended up deciding that I was moving back to Michigan with or without my now ex-husband. I was like, I'm going. And that was because a friend of mine, she didn't believe in the multiple marriage thing too, but she lived on the compound and she lived in a trailer there, and she was trying to sell it and she couldn't get off the land, and they weren't offering her a fair price, so they ultimately burned her out. I mean, it was supposedly an accidental fire, but I know it was not an accident.
Of course.
Yes. And,
No,
her
of
little
course not.
dog was in there. It was so sad. I went to help her, clean up her thing, and you could see the spot on the carpet that didn't have soot and smoke because it was where her little dog was laying. It was so sad. And that was when I really realized that the leader was capable of doing some really horrible, scary things to where I'm like, I don't even feel safe being in this town or being in this state. I got to get out of here. And that's when I told my ex at that time, I'm like, our son and I are going, I'm moving back to Michigan. You can stay if you want, but I'm leaving with or without you. And he wanted to go too. He was like, I'm in, I'm going, let's go. So, our marriage didn't last, but we did leave there together. And he did stay in Michigan for probably 3 or 4 years after that, I believe. But so that was in 1994. And I did create a Facebook group for just survivors of the ex House of Yahweh survivors back in, like, I think it was like 2009. And that was partially because I felt like nobody nobody could really understand what I had been through except other people who had been through it. And so I was reaching out because I was having
Correct.
trouble readjusting into the world and figuring out how to put my life back together and trying to work through things that were triggering me. And so I created that Facebook group to help with that. And then and that was back in 2009, and then I created the Cult Escape and Recovery group in 2020, and that was after actually and I honestly don't know if it was partial suicide or it was an overdose death of a ex-member that really was quite upsetting to me because I really felt like at least a part of the reason that he did that and that happened to him, whether it was partially the substance abuse issues or just partially maybe being suicidal because of everything that he had been through. I felt like I wasn't doing enough for fellow survivors, and I felt like I needed to do more than what I was doing. And that was when I created the Cult Escape and Recovery to cast a wider net, basically, to attempt to help anybody from any cult, find some type of recovery or a group where they could find people who had been through similar experiences so that they could.
And by the way, that Facebook group will be in the show notes. I did manage to put that. So we
Okay.
have our podcast has a Cultimatum group. So
Yes.
if you're listening to this podcast and you want to join our group, but
Yes.
Melody's group that she's referring to is also in the show notes. So if you're a cult member, ex-cult member, survivor,
Yep. You're looking for
it's
support.
what's the name of the group again?
Cult Escape and Recovery.
Tell them the name again.
Cult Escape and
All right, so you
Recovery.
just go to Facebook and you type in right,
Yep.
and I think it's a private group, right? You have to
Yes.
ask to join.
Yes, you do. Yep. That's
Okay, so
true.
but you ask to join, and Melody will vet you, and but feel free to if you are listening and you are looking for support. Melody has done a great job, and by the way, that's where Melody and I met. So
Yes, it is. Yes, it
it's a
is.
great
That's how
group.
we found each other. True, true. So, and I do know there's something else that I kind of touched on, which I found kind of interesting too, was that I remember you had asked how my dad ended up finding the House of Yahweh, and he was kind
Correct.
of searching for the truth and found this booklet called "The Name of the Creator," which basically said that the name of the Creator is Yahweh, and anybody who is worshiping God is essentially worshiping the devil, and that's why your prayers aren't being answered. And and I remember when he first brought some of this literature and material home, they had the holy garments in there, which is very similar to what the Jewish people wear. They wear a talit that they wrap around their shoulders, made of linen, and then a kippah on their head. I think the Jewish people call it a yarmulke, and
Correct.
and the women all wear headscarves covering their heads. And my mom said, that looks like a cult. And I thought we really should have went with her first instinct because she was right. But we all kind of
She
ignored
was
that.
absolutely right.
And then the other thing is that, once we actually went down for our first feast, it was, it wasn't this big grand church that was all beautiful, and it was this little bitty thing, and it was, in Abilene, Texas, of all places. It was dry and dirty and dusty, and there were a lot of people didn't have a lot of money there. You could tell people were poor, but we experienced a lot of love bombing, and we didn't. They said when you get here and you come to the feast, you won't want to leave, and that you find that a little bit hard to believe. But I'll tell you, after we were there for the 8-day feast, we didn't want to leave because it felt so
Well,
welcoming
sure.
and yeah,
Yeah, and what's your favorite word or favorite phrase? That was craftily designed that way. So
exactly. Very
yeah,
intentional. Yep. They wanted us to feel welcome, and I think they do that really to all newcomers, and you don't know the ins and that what's going on in the inner circle until you're in it. And by then you're in it so deep that it's not easy at all to get
You're in
out.
it so deep. Right.
Yes. Yes. I mean, very similar with being in a relationship. Now you're invested and
And
you're like, "Oh, I've invested all this time and I've invested all this money." And it's, some people sell their houses and sell everything they own and move down there. And they're like, "Well, how do I leave now? I've I've invested everything in this place." So,
what
it
is it
makes
about the state of Texas? Because it seems like Texas breeds a lot of cults.
it's funny that you
Almost
should say
every,
that. Yeah. I would agree because
it,
I just had somebody reach out to me today. Actually, the second cousin of mine was like, she knows somebody whose son is in a cult, and she goes, she said it's in Texas, and I don't think it's the same cult, and she said, well, it might be, but I said I doubt it. I said there's lots of cults in Texas. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the heat,
yeah.
because I know.
I just thinking about all the recordings we've done. I must half of them. I think I heard Texas as where they were based.
Yeah, or at least they
Anyway,
have
I
members
just
in
find it
Texas. Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it
Yeah,
is. It is kind of
interesting.
interesting, and of course that's where Waco was, which is a famous
Right,
cult.
exactly.
Yes. So yeah, I my experience was unique, and there were some scary things. There was some, I guess this is one that's pretty crazy, and I'm going to start this by saying this is a rumor that I heard. I did not witness this. I do not know if this is true, but it is one of the more bizarre things that I've heard that they did after I left. So apparently, now again, prefacing this, I don't know if this is true, but I don't know how somebody would make this up if it wasn't. Apparently, one of the weird things that happened after I left was that Israel Hawkins wanted to create an immaculate conception. So he was using turkey basters to try to
Oh
impregnate
boy.
some of the young virgins on the compound, which, as far as I know, it didn't work. But apparently, this was a thing that was happening, which part of the reason I'm mentioning it is just because it's so bizarre that it's one of those things that you hear and you're
Bizarre.
like, can that possibly be true? So,
Melody, at this point, I don't put anything past any cult. From
yeah.
what I'm hearing over the past 6 months of interview, it's just astonishing what they get away with, or what they try to do, or what the tactics they're using. So, by the way, the turkey baster fertility thing is not exclusive to the cult. People are doing it around the world,
Well,
but I would
maybe he
not put
heard
it
it
past
somewhere,
as
and that
yeah.
wouldn't
But I wouldn't
surprise
put
me.
it past them.
No, because
No,
like I
not at
said,
all.
he was notorious for being the potluck of cults because he picked and chose what he wanted out of each religion. He had a little bit of,
Yeah.
he had the Christianity, which was believing in the Messiah. He had the Judaism, which was following the 613 laws of the Old Testament, and the holy garments and the feast days. And we didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter or birthdays, and a lot of that is Jehovah's Witness. And then you had the excommunication, which is like the shunning, and that's kind of like the Amish part that he threw in there. So he took, and then oh, and I forgot about this one too. They also had to all change their name to Hawkins after they started doing the multiple marriage thing, which is very similar to what the Mormons did when they started doing multiple marriage, so that when the government came in, they couldn't tell who was married to who and whose children's were whose. And so they started doing the same thing. Everybody started legally changing their last name to Hawkins. Along with changing their names, they had to devote themselves as slaves to the leader, Israel Hawkins, and they were like they literally were putting their earlobes up to a doorpost and having their ear pierced as a symbol of being a slave to Israel Hawkins. So
It sounds like this cult was, and this is a kind of a funny take on it, but like he was doing the Chinese menu thing, I'll
Yes,
take two from column A, two from column B, of all
exactly.
the other cults around the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
What a, oh
Yeah, so
God.
that was my the reason that I brought that up is you were saying the turkey baster thing and I'm sure he heard it somewhere and thought, well, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me throw that into my cult too, right?
Oh, geez. All right, Melody. Like you would do with another guest, how are you? You've been out for many years. It's been a
Yes.
while, but I'm guessing the Facebook groups were a therapeutic way for you to heal. But any other techniques that you use to? Because you did
Um,
say you struggled for a while.
I did struggle for a while. I do remember like the first time that I was scheduled to work on a Saturday when I left, I had an out and out panic attack because I believed that if I worked on a Saturday that I was going to go to hell. And I had to call and quit my job. I'd only been
Yeah,
working
of
there for
course.
6 days. And I called them and said, I can't function. I can't come to work. And I was just an emotional wreck. And those were the moments when I thought, should I go back? Should I go back? Maybe I should go back because maybe this anxiety will go away. Maybe I'll feel better if I just go back. Even though part of me knew I shouldn't
Mm,
go back, but I was in that in between phase where I was still trying to deconstruct and I was trying to basically rewire my brain to not believe the things
right.
that I'd been taught. So, really, what I had to do was exposure therapy. I had to basically expose myself to that uncomfortable feeling of anxiety until the anxiety level went down enough that I'm like, okay, look it, I'm not dying. I'm not being struck by lightning. I'm still here. I'm
Mm-hmm.
alive. I did these things. I put a Christmas tree in my house. I went 17 years without putting a Christmas tree in my house. So that one took me a little longer to get past. I still believe that Christmas is a pagan holiday, but I don't think it really matters. So I put a tree in my house because I like it and it's fun and it's pretty. So now I do it.
Good.
Now I probably go all out because I'm making up for lost time. But so, and I
Why
think,
not?
yeah,
And listen, the whole world celebrates Christmas. Even
yes,
there's, I have I don't know if I should say this. Let's just say I have family members that are one is Christian and one is Jewish, and
mm,
they put a Christmas tree in the house. So
yeah, there you go. So I
not
mean,
uncommon, not uncommon.
and I think, and I can do this now because, well, we did Mandy's interview. Hers hasn't aired yet, but it will. But a lot like Mandy being so excited to go to a concert, that was kind of me the first time I'd put a Christmas tree up in my house after 17 years. I was like overjoyed to do it. I was just like, ooh, it's so pretty and this is so fun. And because I hadn't done it for 17 years. And, it was something
And there's
I
something
missed out on.
magical about.
Yes, exactly. There
There's
is.
something magical about. I remember growing up, Christmas, the weekend or whatever day you put the tree up, the family gets together and they all hang up ornaments. It's a tradition.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
nothing, pagan or not. It's yeah, all of these holidays around the year. Everything from maybe even maybe the Jewish holidays, they're all have become commercialized. Christmas and
Yes.
Easter. Easter is while it's the Christ rising. It's turned into
Easter
chocolate
Bunny.
bunnies and Easter eggs, and
Yes.
what does that got to do with Jesus?
Yes.
So all of these holidays have become commercialized, and
Absolutely.
while some of the devoted Christians and the Jewish faith are dedicated, the Orthodox, and they don't partake in the marketing part.
Right.
But I go to my local grocery store, and the week after Passover is over, all Passover food is half price.
Yeah.
It's like,
There
so.
you go. But
Uh,
it is very commercial.
um, yeah. Two questions. Anything else you want to tell us, and then I'd like you to give your advice like we did last night with Kimberly,
Yes.
what would you tell somebody who's trying to get out?
Okay. What was the first question? I lost the question.
Anything else that you think? I want to give you
Oh,
a
yes.
chance to
Okay.
finish up.
I wanted to say that part of the reason that I'm so open about my story and my experience is because I feel like if sharing my story and sharing my experience can either possibly prevent somebody from joining a cult that might be thinking about it, or if it can help somebody on that road to recovery, inspire them by hearing that, you know, it does get better, it does get easier with time, because those first few years you're out are very hard, and you feel quite lost in the world, especially if you went in younger, child or teenager. You miss out on kind of
Yeah.
this transitional age where you're supposed to be figuring out how to be an adult, and then you get out and it's like you almost like, because I went in when I was 15 and I left when I was 21 or 20, and it was like I lost 5 years that I'm supposed to be figuring out how to be an adult. And I felt like I was 15 again. I felt like mentally I was still at that 15-year-old level because my my growth had been stunted by the experience. And but I certainly will say that that there is hope out there, and it does get easier. It does get better. I did not get any therapy or counseling. I possibly could have benefited from that. I went to a counselor one time, and I think the counselor had no clue or experience with cults, had no idea what I was going through or talking about, and I could tell that the things they were saying to me weren't going to be helpful. And I just ended up
Right.
not going back, because I think at that point in time it was when there wasn't much awareness. There's a lot more awareness now, because this was back in the mid 90s, and people really didn't have a lot of familiarity. I mean, I don't know now, but I think that from what I've heard, there's actually therapists and counselors that actually specialize in
Oh, I'm
people that
sure.
leave cults now.
Yeah.
And if I'd had one of those back
And
in the day,
and
boy, I'd have
and
felt great.
you also didn't have the internet back in
No,
1995, where
no,
today, 20 years later, you have Facebook and talking about therapists. You could jump online and Google a therapist who specializes in cults, and and I'm sure this Facebook isn't the only support place where support groups can form. I'm sure there's support groups, even locally. I used to run a mood disorder support group for people with mood disorders,
right?
and we met in person. So I'm sure there's a lot of support groups out there.
Yes. And the good thing
But all
about
you
the
got to do is
internet
Google it.
And the good thing about the internet is, even if there's not somebody in your area, you could find somebody in another state, a specialist in another state that might do a Zoom counseling meeting with
Yep.
you, which was not
Yep.
an option in the mid 90s either. So there certainly wasn't anybody in my
Nope.
area at that time. But if I had known there was somebody in another state, I would have had to travel hours to go to them back then.
It's pretty mind-boggling that the term Zoom is fairly new, and it
Yes.
was really only if it wasn't for COVID, people would
No.
not know. Zoom was there before COVID, but it was more for businesses to have conferences and stuff. But when COVID hit, so even things like Zoom today is a great resource to reach out and get support. So, all right, Melody. Anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
So I think I've said everything I want to say. I mean, I'm just going to say that I'm really excited to be doing this with you two, because not only is telling my story therapeutic and part of my healing process, but I feel like I continue to feel more healed when I help other people. And when I
Good.
feel like I'm giving other people a chance to share and tell their stories, it helps me even a little bit more. And so I think that that doing this podcast with you is part of my healing journey.
Well, I'm glad to have you along, and I'm glad that it's helps you further your healing. And again, to anybody who's listening, we are here for you. If you just want to tell your story or join Melody's Escape and Recovery Support Group, you can come to our group as well. And there's many other support groups on the internet for different, either the cult that you were in, there's
Yes.
probably a support group for you getting out, or just general across the board like Melody's, just getting out of any cult. So, and our next couple of episodes, we will, I'll be airing over the next few days. And again, you may or may not hear Melody in some of those. Those are because they were on the other podcast. So Melody
Right.
is our
They were
is a
recorded
permanent co-host now.
before I was in the picture.
Correct.
Yes.
So if you hear an episode on Cultimatum without Melody, it was just because it wasn't recorded while we were a team.
Yes,
So.
exactly.
Okay, Melody.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
What a great story. Thank you. And I can't wait till episode 3.
Excellent. Sounds great. Thank you, Andrew.
All right. Have a good night.
Yep.